Well, hello everyone. I'm JD Schulten. I'm a member of the One Country Project Board, and I'm also a state representative here in Iowa. I'm in the Iowa House District 1. I'm excited to welcome in our next featured speaker, David Pepper. David is a lawyer, writer, political activist, former elected official, and adjunct professor, and has served as the chairman of the Ohio Democratic Party between 2015 and 2021. In that role, he was engaged in numerous fights and extensive litigation over voter suppression and election laws in the Buckeye State. Stemming from that, David worked in All In, or appeared in All In, the documentary highlighting Stacey Abrams' nationwide fight for voting rights. David has written 4 novels that bridge real world politics and fiction. His first novel, The People's House, earned praise for having predicted the Russia scandal. The Wall Street Journal named Pepper one of the best political thriller writers on the scene. For those of you in the audience, we'll be taking questions through the Q&A window, and if we have time at the end, we will answer those. So feel free to ask them during any time during David's remarks. So with that, David, welcome to the Rural Progress Summit.
Thank you, Representative Schulten. It's really good to be with you. I appreciate you mentioning a little bit about background. By the way, I'm in a hotel library in Washington, so I don't even know who that gentleman behind me is. But as you mentioned, I'm normally in Ohio. Hopefully he's a really inspiring figure, but I have no idea. It's really good to be with you. And I'm excited to be here today to talk about how pivotal the rural parts of this country are, not just to obviously the history of our country and economically, socially, everything else, but right now politically, I actually think engaging more robustly in rural America is a critical step to saving democracy. And the representative mentioned several of the books I've written. The fiction, I've also written a few nonfiction books. And unfortunately, as much as I try and spice things up with fiction, my nonfiction books, I worry, are even scarier because they're all about the attack on democracy that we're seeing in this country play out in front of our eyes. And this gets back again to the role that rural America is playing and could play in a better way long term if the Democratic side contested more in these races. So let me walk through real quickly a little bit of a backdrop to why I say that. So let me just pose a hypothetical. I assume everyone can see the screen. What would we do if we saw all the following things happen at one time in another country somewhere? The rigging of legislative elections so 99% of the results were guaranteed. The attack on the independent operations of elections. So the side in power asserted greater control over the elections themselves. A systematic attack, consistent, persistent, on the means by which the voters of the opposition party voted. What if we saw the changing of laws to make it harder for the opposition party to protest? What if we saw a systematic attack on independent courts? What if we saw the elected will of the electorate of a country simply violated, or the constitution of that country simply violated? What if we saw the writing of laws by those in power in such a country to protect themselves, the politicians themselves, from being held accountable for corruption? What if we saw that country literally work to cleanse elements of its own history of events that cast a bad light on the party in control? I go through this set of hypotheticals, and the truth is we are seeing this in other countries. We've seen it over the years. You know, Hungary is a clear example. Russia is an extreme example. But the reason I wrote the nonfiction book I wrote in 21 called Laboratories of Autocracy is because I fear, and I think it's clear, that everything I just described is happening in statehouses around this country. Not just one or two of these things, but almost all of these things in all these statehouses. Now, I'm from Ohio, so I see it in Columbus, but all around the country, what we're seeing is things that if we saw them in another country, we would literally say, my God, you're losing your democracy, you're losing your rule of law. When we see it in our own country, except for true insiders, we too often are hesitant or reluctant or blind enough from it that we don't see it in the same way we would see when we see it in Hungary. But all these things are happening right now, not in Washington. Some things happen in Washington, obviously, but not a lot passes in the end. We know that. The rules kind of slow things down, and it's divided government. But in states all across the country, A set of things is happening that if it were to happen in another country, we would literally be alarmed about attack on democracy, which is happening right here. And this is what led me to write this book I wrote a few years ago called Laboratories of Autocracy, a wake-up call. There is a crisis in American democracy, but it's far more about state houses all around this country than it is about, people who are making all sorts of noise out of Washington or today. It's even bigger than, the court cases we all read about, the trial that apparently we're going to see in Florida around Donald Trump. The biggest crisis in American democracy is coming from state houses. And a lot of you on this call will know why this is, but I want to walk through it. Why state houses? Why are they the place that turn out to be the best place to attack democracy, or the Achilles heel of American governance if you care about democracy? There are a couple key reasons. One, whether it's issues in your communities or whether it's these broader issues of the economy, healthcare, education, energy, climate, these are, state houses control every single issue we care about. A lot of people don't know that. That's a problem, but it's a fact. This includes every issue that's contested in politics today, be it a woman's right to choose, be it what we teach in schools. All these, as you all know, go through state houses far more than the federal government. But the second big thing state houses have is they control most of the rules of the democracy of our country. They write the rules about who votes, when they vote, how they register. They also draw the district lines. And with the power to draw the district lines, they can determine, do we have a robust representative democracy where elected officials feel accountability and where they generally reflect the views of their states? Or if gerrymandered sufficiently, are they simply locked up, like that hypothetical I mentioned at the beginning? I'm going to go quickly here so we have time for questions, but they also obviously have some control over the presidential electoral process. State houses also have enormous power. It gets lost over other officials that are frankly better known than they are. The federal government, most of the funding that goes through a state, it's the state house that's going to really determine how it's spent. Even though Obama opened up Medicaid expansion, if a state house didn't want it, that state didn't get it. Statewide officials are often run over by much less known state house officials. In Ohio, it happens all the time. DeSantis is sort of the opposite of this in Florida, but in most states, the governor is better known and often more moderate. But a state house of gerrymandered officials, more conservative, runs those statewide officials over. Sometimes fellow partisans, in Georgia, they strip powers away from the Secretary of State when he wouldn't go along with the Trump plan to steal an election. So we're talking about not just attacks on the other party, but the offices in their own party, if that office is viewed as a threat to the power in these state houses. As a lot of you know, we also seeing state houses run roughshod over local government on all sorts of issues. One reason state houses have become this source of great power is because far too few people know anything about state houses. Low profile elections. I'll go through it in a second, but these days, a crisis where many of them are uncontested entirely, meaning no one even thinks about these when they think about American politics. The lack of media coverage gets worse as the media declines in so many places. In many states, like where I'm from, Ohio, these are short sessions and they take place far away in state capitals. And so you add all this up and you have a lack of awareness, which makes for a perfect place to cause trouble if you want to. And here's the other problem. There are certain interests in that state house who know exactly what they're up to, know exactly the difference they can make. So they're there directly lobbying all the time. And the lobbying operations in state house have exploded in the last 20 years, while the people back home have no idea what these places are doing. That disconnect turns out to be a real problem. All of that problem, and you all would know this, but I'll walk through it quickly, was made far worse in the 2011 cycle around gerrymandering. Everything I described was already a problem, and then 2011 happened. And I go through examples in that first book of how states that had been largely reflective of their general electorate, and I use this example here. Obama won Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, somewhat narrowly, more decisive in some places than others. And in 2008 in both Congress and the State House, the maps of the districts in both Congress and State House reflected Obama's margin of victory approximately. 4 years later, Obama wins these states by about the same amount. And you'll see that the extreme gerrymandering of 2011 that took place took almost the same exact states and flipped the representation. And that turns out to be, the beginning of a whole new intensity of gerrymandering. The gerrymandering got so intense that, it lasted through 2018. Even when a state like Wisconsin, a majority of the voters, this is the state house races, voted for a Democrat by, in this case, 9 points, and Pennsylvania's 11 points. You see that the legislature reflected the opposite party. And in Wisconsin, a 9-point loss for Republicans across the state led to a massive supermajority in the state house. That is clearly a broken system when it's that off from how the people are voting. But the part of the gerrymander that I think is most problematic that gets lost is how unaccountable the people in many of these districts are. I go through this in the first book, and I'll mention some parts of the second book in a second. What you see is, and again, this is largely going to be, as you all know, rural districts where this is happening. You're seeing districts that are guaranteeing massive blowout elections, 50% plus in Ohio, and 17 of the 62 seats they basically control. The first 50 out of their 62 seats average 20% margin of victory more over an entire decade. So you're basically talking about people whose entire careers in Ohio with 8-year term limits. So these are careers we're talking about spent without any real worry about an election. And one of my theories is once you're in a system with no accountability for the politicians back home, so many of the incentives that actually we hope lead to good public outcomes and good public service, those incentives actually turn upside down. If all of a sudden you never worry about your next election, then public outcomes and the quality of life in your district actually no longer directly impact whether or not you're reelected, right? Because you're elected no matter what. The incentive to serve the public disappears in a world of no accountability. At the same time, going back to what I mentioned earlier about the private interest being right in your state capital, there's a massive incentive to serve those private interests. They could very well determine what happens. Whether or not you're endorsed by certain groups or get money from certain groups could mean you win or lose in a primary. So you have more of an incentive to serve those private interests, less of an incentive or zero incentive to serve public interests. The other thing that all of a sudden changes is you go from having incentive to be mainstream, which I was, let's say, when I was a county commissioner in a 50-50 county, to having an incentive to be extremist, because the only thing you're worried about is a primary and being outflanked to your extreme. The third from the bottom here, you also have this new incentive that if all you've been in your career is an extremist, pushing private interests over the benefit of the public, of course, you know that a fair district in the future would probably mean the end of your career. So, of course, you don't want that either. So now you have this terrible incentive to always attack democracy. And that's what we've seen ever since this started. A nonstop move to the extreme. And you'll see, and this is particularly, I think, in rural America, a downward spiral in so many states like Ohio of outcomes, particularly in rural Ohio. Schools struggling, main streets not repaired, on and on and on, because there's not an incentive to serve. Rural broadband. Literally, these state houses in many cases were encouraged to stop public broadband in rural America because private interests didn't want that to happen. And they did it. Why? Because the private interests are in the face and the folks back home have no idea. And even if they did, they couldn't vote them out. So you have this combination of incentives that have led to more extremism, worse public outcomes, and a continued attack on democracy to keep the accountability out, to keep it all going. I won't go through all the details, but the problem here is not just individual states, as I'm sure you all know. It's the fact that this is now to accomplish a very right-wing view of the world. This view, everything I've just described is not happening one state at a time. It's happening in a coordinated fashion. And the laws that are being advanced through these systems with warped incentives are being written elsewhere and jammed through these state houses. The people writing them know full well that these are people who are incentivized to support private interests and to not worry so much about public outcomes because the public has no choice in the matter. And so over the last generation, this has been sort of the game. I don't have time to go through all the details. I want to get to questions, but basically the title Laboratories of Autocracy is not some cute title. They have learned over, the years, sorry to go back and forth here, a lot of lessons. So they are perfecting this process of using state houses to advance that agenda all the while public outcomes disintegrate as things from the public are being pushed towards the private players I mentioned. 2021 gets a lot of attention, and somehow people think, well, this is a reaction to the big lie in Trump. My theory is absolutely not. This was simply an extension of years of attacking democracy and public goods through these rigged state houses. And if you look closely, everything that happened between 2011, 2020 accelerated in 21, but none of it was really new. They began stripping powers from governors they didn't like back in 16, on and on and on. What's new is how extreme it's gotten with the censoring of history, with the stoking of vigilantism. But overall, what we're seeing is an extension of something that started a while back. And that's an important thing to remember. This didn't all start because of Trump or the big lie. This started long before. It has only accelerated. So what we have right now is, and I can't spend much time on this either, but what we have right now is really a dual world. We have a side, and my guess is mostly folks on calls like this, Democrats, independents, the media, sort of mainstream America is still living thinking, well, democracy is safe. The main political battle is actually a battle over federal swing states. If you win those, you win. But the problem with that side's view is there's another side that is not so sort of accepting that democracy is intact. And that side also understands that many of its strongest beliefs are deeply unpopular. So that side isn't content to simply run a bunch of elections in swing states. In fact, that would be a losing strategy for them. Instead, they need to undermine democracy by enough to lock in a minority worldview. And they have figured out the way to do that is not through federal swing state elections. It's to take advantage of everything I just talked about. Go for broken states, gerrymander state houses, suppress the vote of the other side, and run through a whole lot of laws that would never actually succeed or survive, or you wouldn't get reelected if you push them in a world of fair districts and competitive democracy. And this is the battle that we're in. And I worry greatly that too many people still are preparing and waging politics, thinking that the side on the left here is the battle, when we're in fact in a battle for democracy that is taking place in state after state. Let me just stop for a second and add one point that I just added in this new book I've written. So I wrote a book. After I wrote this first book, I got a whole lot of feedback. Well, that's wonderful, but what can we do about this problem, David, that you're talking? It's pretty disturbing. And so I wrote a new book called Saving Democracy, a User's Manual for Every American. And it walks through all the things that I hope people will do about it. But to show really quickly one of the problems, as much as gerrymandering is a terrible problem, it is, and this really gets to the problem in rural America, because I think almost all these districts are rural America. In the new book, I went through all the states to show that not only are they gerrymandered, but in these states, if you look at these columns, these are state houses. And this is a listing of all the uncontested races across America. And you will see that if you think gerrymandering itself is a problem, it's actually far worse when you look at no one running at all. 50% of the Tennessee Republican delegation that made so much noise and gained infamy, depending on your viewpoint, 50% of that group did not face a re-election challenge in November of 22. Texas, 42%. Ohio, I think, is too high, but actually doing a little better, 27%. I was in Oklahoma last week. It's more than half. And when you stop and think about it, the damage done by not running is actually even worse than the damage done by gerrymandering, because it literally means that we have all these officials passing all these extreme laws, attacking democracy, attacking mainstream values in their states, taking goods that are of the public sector and forking them over to the private, such as no rural broadband because the private sector doesn't want it. Or here's a bunch of public school money. We're not going to give it to the rural public schools. We're going to give it to sort of a bunch of schemes that keep the money out of those schools so those schools collapse. They can do all of that. And as unpopular as it may be to pack rural public schools, not even face a re-election. So, of course, the extremism gets worse. That's a really important thing that we all have to start doing is, and my fear is that most of where this is happening is rural America. And one party simply is not in rural America. And that makes it all so much worse, not because you're going to win every election if you contest everywhere, but if you do contest everywhere, you're holding people accountable everywhere. You're pushing the curve back to more sort of mainstream as opposed to a battle over the extreme. You may win because you're the one who pinpointed that rural public school died because of that terrible state house plan to privatize everything, or hospitals have died because of insufficient health care. But if you're not running, you can't say those things, and no one even knows those things are happening. So I go through in both books a whole series of steps that we have to, I believe, undertake. Let me try and find where I was before, and I won't go through all of them, but I go through them in great detail in the books. One, once you see that we're in a battle for democracy, you've got to see it as a long battle. In the old system where we build right at the end and have this big, massive election, and then we put it all away for 2 years, that means we're never building in rural America. We don't even begin to build there because we don't have time or resources built that way. If we're going to have once you see it's a battle for democracy, you should see that it's a battle everywhere. And you should see that it's a long game if you build the infrastructure to do that. Number two, it's a battle in all 50 states. I'll say this, having had Ohio be a swing state for a long time, it is simply wrong that we have decided, those of us who care about democracy, that the battle for democracy is only worth fighting in states that happen to be federal swing states for federal elections. That is simply casting dozens of states aside to be, swallowed up by extremism and no accountability and gerrymandering and uncontested races. And we now see across the country every week the damage that is done when we simply say, oh, you're not a swing state, sorry, we're not really going to be there. It's when one side is the only one in the game, it gets more and more extreme. If both sides are there battling for democracy and pushing for the public good of the places they represent, things even out some. And that's a real problem, I think, that we aren't seeing a 50-state battle for democracy. It's confined to a few states, and that has massive consequences that I don't have time to go through, but really beyond just winning and losing. If you lose but run a hard race, there's accountability. If you don't run at all, it gets more and more extreme. And that's why states that only a couple of years ago were moderate. Iowa voted for Obama. Iowa, Indiana, Missouri voted for Clinton. They are all off in a downward spiral towards extremism because one side really isn't there engaged, and that fuels the problem. Once you get, and this is another very important part for rural America, once you're at that state level, the state house is the key. But again, don't only focus on the suburban swing districts or the cities, although we obviously have to win there. The rural districts are where so much of the extremism is happening with no one challenging any of it. So if half of your delegation is from a rural part of your state, let's say like Ohio or small towns, and you never even value running there, so that they're never contested, they're going to run the show. And that's what's happening. So I go through in both books, we have to run across states for democracy, and we have to recruit and support candidates, not that they're all going to win, but by enough that they can start bringing accountability back to rural America, which is, again, where I think the other side is truly running roughshod with their extremism. It's much bigger than Trump, and this is a very important day to say this. This started before Trump ran. If he were locked up tomorrow, which used to be a hypothetical, but now isn't, it would all still continue because it's based in states. We have to see this as much bigger and deeper than simply about one person. And the final thing I hope people really think about when they realize it's a battle for democracy is that there's so much more. And this is what the second book I've written called Saving Democracy is all about. There is so much more we can all do to battle for democracy than simply giving a few bucks to some swing state somewhere. Once you realize it's a battle for democracy in your town, in your state, where it's long been overlooked, my hope is you can see there is so much more we all can do to battle for democracy, whether it's making sure that no uncontested races go on anymore. We run everywhere. Whether it's making sure that disenfranchised voters that have been systematically disenfranchised, young voters, voters of color, in some cases seniors, voters of poverty, that we are doing everything we can, wherever we can, to lift those folks. Because even if we're not a swing state, that's part of the big battle of pushing for democracy. I won't go through all the other ones, but the point is there's so much more we could do in the battle for democracy once we realize it's not about DOJ investigations, although those are important. It's not just about a few swing states. It's a state level battle that's taking place, which means it's happening everywhere, which means it's in our backyards. There is so much more we can do about it. With that, I'll stop talking. Would love to go to questions, but this really takes you to the point, which is, I think, the rural parts of this country, including in Ohio, including where I was in Oklahoma last week. In many, that is the front line in so many ways. And so you're on the front lines. Whatever we can do to work together to push back on those front lines to get our democracy back in check, back in balance, we've got to do. So with that, I'll stop talking and take a few questions. Thanks, everybody. Hope that was helpful.
Yeah, that was great, David. Thank you very much. So we have a couple of questions from the audience. The first one I think you've touched on a little bit, but I'm sure you have plenty more thoughts to expound on. Katrina asked, how do you suggest we dismantle radical authoritarian state legislatures?
So obviously, a huge role to be played when we gain majorities in Congress. The most powerful instrument we have to do it is robust legislation like the Voting Rights Act, if and when we get power again, which I hope is in 24. We failed to do that in 21, 22, to my eternal frustration. But so that's it. And to the extent we can all advocate to anyone we know at the federal level, next time, the first thing we have to do when we have power is to shore up democracy in states. We have to do. But we just can't sit around and think about that for 2 years, right? Or however long. There's so much we can do. I'd say the first thing is, if you have the ability, and I know you were talking about this in some of your sessions, if you have the ability to bring referenda forward to end gerrymandering where you are. Some states have this, some states don't. Like Michigan did, great example. Other states have done it. If you can, building a movement to do that is critical. We did in Ohio. Sadly, our legislature got away with violating our new rules. But what we found in many of these states is, if you get it on that ballot, it's very popular. Ours in Ohio passed 70-30. Michigan's was a true grassroots effort. It passed. They were able to ungerrymander because of it. So if you have the ability, I'm a believer also in these nonpartisan primary reforms. I think those are a big change that get some of that incentive to be an extremist out of the system. I think if J.D. Vance had been in a nonpartisan primary system, he would have been the J.D. Vance who wrote the book, who said he voted against Trump, as opposed to the one who did what he did. I think that the incentives in these primaries really are pushing people. So if you can push that kind of reform, wonderful. A couple other things. Before you've solved gerrymandering, if you haven't solved it, we have to run everywhere. And this is something that some people don't like that I say this, because they think, well, it's a waste of money. It doesn't. We've tried the experiment of letting people run unopposed again and again. Look what's happening because of that. It's a disaster. It's extremism run amok. Running a credible person with some support makes a big difference over time. If it's our default, we never let someone run unopposed, that will start to create some more accountability back into systems that no longer have it. People ask me all the time, well, how are you going to do that? Is there money for that? Amy McGrath raised $100 million to run against Mitch McConnell. Millions of dollars flowed to a Wisconsin Supreme Court race because people thought democracy was on the line. We didn't lose a single race in November of last year when an election denier was running for Secretary of State because people got fired up. There's a grassroots donor base that gets fired up about democracy. Our problem is we have not had a conversation enough that saving democracy is not just about beating Mitch McConnell. It's about running everywhere and supporting people running on the front line, which is in state houses. So when I mentioned Amy McGrath, that $100 million, good for her. She did what she needed to do. She raised a lot of money. But as a group, let's figure out, maybe we could take 30 million of that 100 million and put it into dozens and dozens and dozens of state house races that wouldn't have been running or would fully fund them. And we will be better for democracy. And there's still $70 million to run TV against Mitch McConnell. I go through in the book, that's a sort of a high level way of talking about it. There are best practices right now. We're trying to build one in Ohio where we are group funding support to candidates across an entire state to start literally running everywhere, and to have those candidates not left out on their own, but actually have an infrastructure that values them enough that they want to run everywhere. So I think, and the last thing I'd say is, and there's a lot to this, very good question. These systems right now, many states completely lack accountability. And we know when someone doesn't sense accountability, they don't just say, "Phew, I got away with something." We see it with Donald Trump. They actually go further every time. These state houses have literally been living with no accountability for too long. And so beyond running against folks, whenever there are other ways to bring accountability, if a local, like in Georgia, if a local prosecutor can bring something for a federal, a crime, I'm sorry, a state felony, which are occurring in some places, don't be shy about it. If a bar association finds that a lawyer in office has done something that violates a bar, bring some accountability. If a private lawsuit, like the one being brought against DeSantis, clearly a First Amendment problem he created. Anytime you could bring accountability is once again a push back against what's essentially been unaccountable extremism in these places for far too long. All those steps and more, that's just a short menu of what we have to do. Oh, by the way, one other one, Tom, advocacy, advocacy, advocacy. I have a whole chapter on this in this new book. There are so many ways that people can advocate at the State House. And oftentimes these bills go through and no one's even in the room. And when they're in the room, as I go through the book, it can make a huge difference. And that also includes supportive education. Banning books is really unpopular, folks. If you show up at a school board and make a lot of noise, all around the country when this happens, those who are opposing the book bans are winning because it turns out to be really unpopular. So nonstop advocacy, if you yourself aren't running, is really, really important as well.
Yeah, those are all great points. And I mean, I think especially sort of the idea about the inefficiency of the grassroots money cannon being fired off at races where there's more money that can ever be spent, and then other people are going hungry.
Yeah, right in the neighborhood. In the neighborhood.
We have one additional question, which it talks about sort of this is the thing that always bugs me when people talk about the Democratic brand being spoiled, as if we just like change the typeface, suddenly things will be fine. Curious to get your thoughts on if we think part of the Democratic brand, in addition to, the Fox News disinformation kind of realm, that part of it is a self-inflicted damage through candidates often running against their own party and giving the impression that they don't even want to be part of the Democratic Party when running in rural and conservative areas.
Yeah, I do think that can contribute to the problem. Here's what I'd say about the brand. And I look at good candidates like a Sherrod Brown, who and Tim Ryan ran well ahead of folks. Now he ran away a little bit, I'd say, but overall, I think the common denominator of people who are doing well doing better. And in Ohio, you don't need to win rural Ohio. You just need to get close to what Obama did, which was 40%, as opposed to being mired in the 20s, which then the math just doesn't add up to victory. I think to me, the brand, the best brand is the one where someone has broken through, that despite maybe some disagreements, even on the more progressive things that a Sherrod Brown cares about, people in Ohio look at Sherrod Brown and they think that guy's fighting for me. And it's almost like a personal, that guy, like FDR did, or like Truman did, he gets me, he gets my life, he gets my struggles, and he's fighting for me in my community. And once they're there on that, then they can forgive the fact that they may not agree on something else. And I think it's being authentic enough that they feel that about you. It's not just a brand. We did a brand exercise when I was chair of the party, and the brand that stuck out, and you hear this every once in a while from Democrats, we did all sorts of focus groups, and it was what we've always liked about the Democrats is they are for people first. And the Republicans always seem to be for the big shots. That's still probably the strongest part of our brand. But what I'd say, and this is beyond brand, what I think is an opportunity right now, right in front of us, and my guess is you talked a lot about this in the last couple of days. If you believe what I am saying about these incentives being screwed up in states, and that there's an incentive to deliver stuff to the private sector and take it away from the public, like rural broadband, like rural schools, which are the heart of rural communities, as you all know better than me. To me, that is the strongest message. Identify the public outcomes that are inevitably collapsing in these states, which they are, and run really hard on those because you care about them more than the state rep in that area who's voted the other way. Laura Kelly is the governor of Kansas. What did she run on? Beginning to end, almost never veered off topic, the decline of rural public schools and public schools generally under Sam Brownback's trickle-down economics. And she won going away. She didn't focus on Chris Kobach and all she could have said. It was all about rural public schools. And Gretchen Whitmer did a similar thing when she said, fix the damn roads. It was about public outcomes that people care about, that are not viewed as partisan necessarily, but they're collapsing in these broken and often corrupted systems. Brett Favre giving away, TANF money to volleyball courts. I mean, there are real impacts. And so I think a lot, going back to that person's fighting for me brand that I think we need, finding those specific issues that folks, again, I have, they just walked in the room. I have 2 kids, 9 and 6. If you told me and my wife that we were down to 4 days of school a week, that's not just an education crisis, that's a family crisis. And we have places where that's happening, where families are being left in the lurch. Those, I think, are the issues that can give candidates in tougher places to run really good issues to fight on and to work on, and to be able to build this brand that you're looking out for the little guy, while that incumbent state rep is literally giving away the farm, no pun intended, to private school operators or to utilities who want broadband for themselves, so they don't want it in rural parts of our country. So there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, that's terrific remarks. I agree with just about every single thing you said. So I wish we had more time. We're unfortunately right at time right now. But I want to thank you so much for joining us. It's a great conversation. Hopefully everyone listening at home can pick up your book. Now I'm going to turn it over to Senator Heidi Heitkamp for a conversation about previewing the 2024 elections with Tim Miller and Jonathan Cott. Reminder to everybody in the audience, if you want to join that, you'll be moved back to the lobby when we conclude here. You can select that from the list of upcoming sessions and join from there. David, thank you again for joining us.
Thanks again, Tom. Stay in touch, everybody. See ya.